Have you ever been so far from civilization that silence doesn't just surround you, it swallows you? That's exactly where Captain Brighton and his crew found themselves on the morning of September 23rd, 1839. Their ship was slicing through the bitter winds of the Drake Passage just off the northern coast of Antarctica, an unforgiving stretch of sea known not just for its bone-deep cold, but for being nearly untouched by mankind. Brighton and his crew weren't just sightseeing, they were professional whalers, chasing rumors of a massive population of whales hiding out in these remote waters. But after weeks of sailing, not a single tail, not a single spout, nothing. Just endless ice and a creeping sense that maybe they were chasing shadows. The night before, things took a dangerous turn. The surrounding ocean froze solid, locking their ship in place like nature's own trap. Brighton knew what this meant. If they didn't break free, they'd be stranded here for months. And winter in the Drake Passage wasn't something you survived. You endured it, or you didn't. But ironically, it was a brutal storm that saved them. Crashing waves and lashing winds broke the ice apart, freeing the ship just before it was too late. Now, in the quiet after the storm, Brighton stood on the deck, weighing an impossible decision. Push further and hope to find whales, or turn back before the ice returned and sealed their fate for good. That's when he spotted something, a dark silhouette on the horizon. At first he thought maybe he was seeing things. After all, out here it was supposed to be just them. No other ships, no other souls, just the cold. But the shape didn't vanish. It grew. It was getting closer. It was a schooner. Now schooners were built for distance, not whaling. That alone was strange. But what really caught Brighton's attention was its condition-torn sails, a hull that looked battered by more than just time. Something wasn't right. Maybe they were trapped in the ice too, he thought. Maybe they'd been out here for too long. And if that were the case, they might need help. Supplies, food, anything. Brighton called out to his men. They readied a small dinghy, packed up some extra provisions, and set off toward the mysterious schooner. The closer they got, the stranger things became. The ship was swaying gently with the sea, its sides creaking. As they approached the portholes, they could see shadows, people, motionless figures inside the cabin. Brighton shouted, tried to make contact, but there was no response, just the howling wind. Finally, they reached the side of the ship and climbed aboard. The deck was empty, completely deserted. But everything was intact, ropes, tied gear in place. Like someone had just stepped away, they made their way toward the captain's quarters. Brighton knocked, called out. Nothing. Only the sound of waves licking against the wood. Eventually, he opened the door, and inside, sitting perfectly still at the desk, was a man. Back turned, unmoving, the crew stood frozen in the doorway. Brighton took a step inside, then another. He called again. No reply. He was now close enough to read what the man had been writing, and that's when his stomach turned. The entry was short, just a single line trapped by icebergs. Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains. But it wasn't the message that chilled Brighton to the bone. It was the date above it, January 17th, 1823, 16 years ago. Brighton's eyes snapped back to the man at the desk. still unmoving, still seated like he was alive. But this wasn't a man holding on to life, this was a corpse, frozen stiff, preserved by time and temperature. The rest of the crew moved in their breath, catching in their throats as they began exploring the ship. And what they found was beyond comprehension. In the galley, 4 men sat around a table with cards still in their hands, mid-game. A woman lay in her bunk, curled around her dog. Both had passed in their sleep. In the dining hall, figures were seated upright, heads bowed like they were waiting for a meal that would never come. Every room they entered was a time capsule. Life had simply stopped. This crew hadn't died in panic. There was no chaos, no blood. They had simply frozen. One by one, quietly, with dignity. For 16 years, that schooner had drifted silently across one of the world's harshest oceans, carrying the remains of an entire crew perfectly preserved, waiting to be discovered. And it was Brighton who found them. Just one night before he and his own crew might have met the same fate. Captain Brighton stood there for a long time, his breath fogging the cabin's cold air. He couldn't look away from the captain's lifeless body, still sitting at his post, still facing forward like he had waited for someone, for rescue, or maybe for a witness. Brighton's men, seasoned whalers who had gutted monsters from the sea, were now pale and unsteady. The silence inside the ship wasn't just heavy, it felt sacred. Like they were walking through a graveyard, built not of earth and stone, but of ice and time. One of the crew members, Jonathan, moved quietly to the journal lying next to the dead captain's hand. He didn't want to touch it, not really, but something about it called to him. The ink was faded but readable. Entry after entry dated weeks apart. Each one colder, shorter, more resigned. Food is gone, morale holding. Tried burning furniture, smoke too thick below deck. One man wandered onto the ice, never returned. We sleep more now. It's easier. And then near the end, an entry in shakier handwriting. We thought the sun would come. We kept believing. Now we wait together. That was it. That's how they died. Not screaming, not fighting, but waiting, together. As Brighton and his men moved through the ship, a strange awareness settled over them. Everything was exactly as it had been left. Cups on tables, a pipe half-packed with tobacco, a violin resting against a chair, strings still intact. But it was what they found below deck that truly shook them. In the storage hold beyond where the barrels of spoiled flour and dried fish had once been stacked, there were crates, dozens of them, labeled in stenciled letters. Property of the United States Naval Scientific Division. Brighton frowned. This wasn't a military vessel. Why would a whaling crew be carrying government cargo? Jonathan pried open one of the crates. Inside was a large metallic device, circular with strange dials and protruding copper tubes. Next to it, sealed in waxed paper, were notes, diagrams, instructions. Brighton picked one up. The writing was in English, but it made no sense. References to atmospheric resonance, frequency isolation, something called Project Luxor. They opened another crate. This time the contents were wrapped in thick cloth. Brighton pulled it back, revealing what looked like A helmet, except it wasn't designed for protection. There were wires inside, electrodes, and on the crown a stamped insignia, a triangle inside a circle. Suddenly the air felt colder. Jonathan, flipping through the documents, read aloud. Test failed. Induced mass hallucination. Subjects unaware of passage of time. Containment lost. Recommendation scuttle. Scuttle. As in sink the ship. Brighton looked around at the quiet crew, now realizing they weren't just standing in a graveyard. They were standing in the middle of an experiment that had gone horribly wrong. An experiment never meant to be found. Whatever had happened on this ship wasn't natural. It was controlled. By the time they returned to their own vessel, the sky was darkening again. The storm that had freed them now loomed behind them, thick clouds like bruises on the horizon. Back aboard, Brighton ordered the men to get moving. Fast. He didn't want to be anywhere near that ghost ship when night fell again. But as they prepared to leave, one of the younger sailors, Matthew, refused to board. He stood on the edge of the schooner's deck, staring out into the sea like he was hearing something the rest of them couldn't. Matthew Brighton shouted, "We're leaving, but—" Matthew didn't answer. He just turned eyes glassy and whispered, "They're still alive." It was nonsense. Delirium. Fear, maybe. Brighton climbed back over, grabbed the young man by the arm and hauled him to the boat. But as he did, he caught a final glimpse inside the schooner's windows. And for a moment, just a split second, he swore he saw the man at the desk move. It was probably the wind, a trick of light. But that image, it stayed with him. They returned to their ship and set sail, immediately cutting hard away from the schooner and toward the open sea. The sky cracked above them as snow began to fall in slow, heavy flakes. The crew didn't speak that night. Not about the frozen bodies, not about the equipment, and not about the fact that when they looked back one last time, the schooner was gone. Not drifting, not sinking. Just gone. 2 weeks later, Captain Brighton docked at a port in Argentina and sent an encrypted letter to the United States Naval Office detailing everything he'd seen. A month after that, he received a reply. But it wasn't what he expected. The letter denied any record of a scientific division using the name Project Luxor. It claimed no vessel matching the schooner's description had ever been registered, and it stated that any future communication on the matter would be considered a breach of naval protocol. The message was clear: forget what you saw. Brighton didn't talk about it again. Not publicly. Not even to his own family. But he recorded everything in a leather-bound logbook, which was discovered decades later in a sealed trunk among his personal effects. And that logbook is how we know what happened. Or rather, what may have happened. Because here's the thing. That schooner, it's still out there. Every few years, sightings surface. Always the same description. Tattered sails, silent deck, and always appearing just before the ice sets in. Some say it's a ghost ship, a myth. Others believe it was never a ship at all, but a test sent adrift. A floating prison for minds pushed too far. But if you ever find yourself in the Drake Passage just as the water starts to freeze, look to the horizon. And if you see a silhouette drifting quietly through the fog, turn back. Years passed, decades even. Captain Brighton died in 1884, long retired, never having returned to Antarctic waters. His logbook, the only written record of the encounter, was found in a sealed trunk in the attic of his great-grandson's home in Maine. The pages were yellowed, but the ink had held, and the story inside was chilling. Even more so because Brighton wasn't a storyteller. His entries were plain, factual, almost clinical. But the way he described that schooner, its silence, its stillness, felt like someone writing about a wound they'd never fully recovered from. The journal eventually ended up in the private archive of a maritime historian named Dr. Elliot Farrow. He was a skeptic by trade. Ghost stories, sea myths, they made good campfire tales, but not good history. But something about Brighton's account nagged at him. The dates, the coordinates, the ship's detailed layout. It all felt too specific, too grounded to dismiss. So in 2002, Farrow published a paper, The Silent Schooner, a case study in maritime anomaly. It was quickly dismissed by mainstream academia, too speculative, too unprovable. But among a small community of naval historians and deep-sea explorers, it sparked a quiet fire. And then, something happened. In 2007, a research vessel out of Chile, the Annabella, was conducting sonar mapping near the South Shetland Islands when it encountered a large, unmapped object just beneath the ice shelf. The crew assumed it was a glacier fragment or underwater rock formation. But when divers went down, they found wood, timbers, rotted but unmistakably shaped, ship architecture. And on one of the beams, barely visible under decades of decay and ice scarring, was a single marking, a triangle inside a circle. The same symbol Brighton had described. The dive team attempted a second descent, but when they returned 3 days later, the object was gone. No movement detected. No current strong enough to carry it. Just gone. Vanished. Just like Brighton had said. That should have been the end of it. A strange maritime coincidence. Another footnote in a growing archive of half-believed tales. But in 2015, a man named Arthur Graves made a post on a deep-sea enthusiast forum. He was a retired satellite technician who'd worked for a private defense contractor in the early 1990s. His post was short, just a few paragraphs, but it rattled the community. He claimed that in 1991, his team had been asked to quietly monitor an anomaly in the Drake Passage. A moving heat signature that showed no propulsion, no mechanical activity, but drifted with remarkable precision through the sea. It appeared once every 7 to 9 years, stayed on surface-level scans for roughly 72 hours, then vanished again. They'd nicknamed it the Dead Pulse. When asked what it might have been, Graves said, "We were told not to ask." But one of the guys joked, "Maybe it's the ship that never finished dying." What makes this story so disturbing isn't just that it happened. It's that it keeps happening. Brighton wasn't the last to see the ghost ship. He might have been the first to document it, but he wasn't alone. In 1938, an Argentine fishing vessel reported spotting an empty sail ship drifting off the ice shelf. The crew claimed it had no crew on board and no flag, but didn't record any identifying details. The captain later refused to speak about it. In 1969, during a Soviet expedition, a submersible drone recorded footage of what looked like an early 19th century vessel locked under a frozen shelf. The footage was never released publicly, but stills were leaked. One image shows what looks like a violin case frozen against the inside of a cabin window. And most recently, in 2021, a recreational drone flown by a Canadian tourist in the Antarctic Peninsula captured a fleeting glimpse of a wooden hull peeking through ice mist just for a second before it slid back behind a shroud of fog. When experts analyzed the footage, they couldn't confirm anything, but those who know the story. They didn't need confirmation. They already knew. There's something about the sea that doesn't let things go. Bodies sink, wrecks rot, names fade, but some stories, they linger. Not because of ghosts or curses, but because of what they reveal about us, about our need to understand, about our terror of isolation, about the things we build, machines, missions, ideas, and how sometimes they drift away from us. Literally. What happened aboard that schooner might never be fully explained. Maybe it was a failed experiment. Maybe it was something darker, a psychological weapon, a test of consciousness. Or maybe it was something ancient the government tried to replicate and couldn't control. Whatever the truth is, it floats out there somewhere in the coldest waters on Earth, waiting. So if one day you find yourself on a ship deep in the Drake Passage, and the ocean suddenly stills, and your instruments begin to glitch, and someone shouts that there's another vessel on the horizon, one not listed on radar, not answering hails, don't go closer, don't board it, because that ship doesn't want to be saved. It wants to be remembered.